I hope you all have a really good lunch. Given time, I'd like to get started with our afternoon keynote speaker, Dr. John Scanlon. Dr. Scanlon is a staff researcher, staff safety researcher at Waymo, which doesn't really need any introduction in terms of his company. John works on the Severity and Safety Impact team, where he leads multiple projects that estimate the potential for Waymo technology to improve roadway safety. His work focuses on both prospective assessment of injury risk and retrospective evaluation of safety performance. Before John joining Waymo, he worked at the Exponent's vehicle engineering practice, where he managed a wide range of clients' projects on the topic related with crash reconstruction, automotive safety, and vehicle design. So please join me, welcome John on the stage.
All right. So hello, everyone. My name's, again, John Scanlon. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be here today to be able to talk to you all about Waymo. And I have a couple major things that I kind of want to make sure that I inform you guys on. Is one, I want to talk about, what is Waymo and our current scale and kind of direction we're heading. The second thing I want to talk about is general safety methodologies. And then the third thing is I want to dive into a little bit on the research that I work on and on the Severity and Safety Impact team related to measuring safety impact both in the prospective sense and making future estimations, but also in the retrospective sense of historically looking at on-road performance and trying to evaluate just how effective was the technology after it was deployed. So. I don't think you can start a talk about Waymo without first talking about our mission, because I think it gives a lot of perspective on what we are and what we're trying to do. So our mission is to be the world's most trusted driver, and there's a few different aspects of that that I think are important to pull out. One is world. Our ambitions are not just to operate nationally within the U.S., but internationally. That idea of trust, and of course, a big component of trust is safety, which is where my heart is and where all my time and dedication is. And then the final thing is that we are developing a driver. So we put a system onto a base vehicle and enabled to drive, but it's not. It's a driver of multiple different applications. So right now we're working in ride hailing, but our ambitions are much larger than that. So as I mentioned, the Waymo, we use base vehicles that are already created. So this is a Jaguar I-Pace. In all our commercial operations now, this is what's on the road. On top of this vehicle, we put in compute. We put in a variety of different perception sensors. So it's things like LiDAR and camera and radar. And then we also have these audio receptors as well that, and all of it together kind of enables, and the audio receptors are for things like sirens and things coming around corners, so you can kind of detect where they are and where they're coming from beforehand. So these sensors kind of give you this 360 degrees, 300 meters out, every day of the year, rain or snow, fog, rain, fog, it allows you to kind of operate this driver. And in addition to this, we have two new vehicles coming on the platform. There'll be a Geely Zeekr vehicle, and then there's also going to be this the Hyundai Ioniq coming on. So I'm pretty excited about that. It allows us to kind of have a more affordable vehicle without compromising the safety and any of the perception needs. It actually is able to see a little bit farther, so it's pretty exciting. So right now, Waymo commercially operates in 4 different cities: San Francisco, Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Austin. These are pretty big deployment areas that we're in. So in San Francisco, it's all 50 square miles, and then we're also down in a little bit into the Bay Area there. There's in Los Angeles, it's like 80 square miles, and in Phoenix, Arizona, I think it's over 300 square miles. In Austin, it's not quite 50, but these are large areas. They're all surface streets in that area. Again, it's 365 days a year, 24/7. So in addition to that, we have expansion plans coming imminently in Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Georgia, and Miami, Florida. And then we test in a number of different cities, including an ongoing road trip that we're doing this summer. or this year, not summer, but so I think we Las Vegas, San Diego, New Orleans, and then most recently there's Nashville, Tennessee. I wasn't even able to update the graph for that one. So again, I'm on the safety team. That's where all of my focus is, on both the internal safety analysis, but also on externally communicating safety, and developing research for the external community as well. So I want to give a broad overview of the safety methodologies, because there is absolutely no way I could touch on all of it in one presentation. But I do think it's important just to understand that there's a variety of multiple complementary analyses that kind of go on when deciding to deploy at a given scale for this technology. This includes the behavioral components, the architectural components, and also the in-vehicle operation. So yeah, as you can imagine, there's risk in all of it, and you have to be able to evaluate it. All these different evaluations are kind of done at both the event level, but also at the aggregate level type analysis. And in this evaluation that's being done in a constant, continuous cycle, it's constantly evolving, it's changing. And it's all based on the methodologies, and the targets are always pre-specified, as they should be up front. And then during the evaluation cycle, there's a determination of whether it's been achieved. So I wanted to make, and also I have, all throughout the presentation, I have links to various papers we've written on here. Some of them are white papers like this one, but others are, in the peer-reviewed journals. So keep track of the. But I'll also give a link at the end where you can kind of find everything. So we also have a safety case, which is kind of the evaluation of the various safety methodologies, and making sure that all the arguments that we want to be able to achieve, that we have sufficient evidence, and that the arguments themselves are, or the methodologies themselves are comprehensive. So we put out also the study last year on or 2 years ago, on building a credible case for safety. And it kind of dives into this general notion that in all of our safety methodologies, what we're trying to achieve is this idea of an absence of unreasonable risk for that given deployment scale. And I think it's a really important philosophical concept as you're thinking about, how did Waymo know they were ready to deploy at a certain level? So, all right, so again, I'm on the safety research team. I've been in research for many, many years now. And my research is predominantly in safety impact, but our group, safety research as a whole at Waymo, has 3 major arms, and that's the human behavior analytics team, severity and safety impact team, and then there's the best practices team, which works on a lot of the external standards engagements, but also will create a lot of thought pieces on direction of methodology as a whole. So you can find all of our research at waymo.com/safety-research. We try to peer review everything that's would be eligible for a journal. So that generally takes some time. So usually we'll put it up on the archive first, and then we'll release it. Or then once it's through the peer review process, we'll update it with the updated journal paper as well, or conference paper. All right, so I want to dive in. I'm making good time, great. All right, so I want to dive into safety impact analysis, which it's commonly referred to maybe as safety benefits analysis. People might have heard it, but I don't really like that term, because you can have both benefits and disbenefits, so it's important to look at it from an impact perspective. There's a lot of different methodologies, and they can kind of be divided up into those that are prospective, so trying to make estimations about how effective the technology will be in the future. And then there's this idea of a retrospective analysis. So, given that you have that kind of, in vivo data, how effective actually was the technology. As you deploy and scale, your ability to rely on more of the retrospective grows, but maybe there's some rarer cases that you want to have to rely on some of the prospective analysis. So there's this balancing act that happens kind of as you're in the middle there, and still penetrating a market. So the prospective safety impact technique that I want to talk about is scenario-based testing, which I thought was really timely for a lot of the folks in the audience, or really on topic for a lot of the folks. This is not intended to be comprehensive of all the scenario-based testing we do at Waymo, but I wanted to give a good flavor of it. So a few years ago, one of our first studies that we put out was on using fatal reconstructions and doing a counterfactual simulation of how effective this technology would be. Before I kind of dive into this, just recognize that we do this is a small sliver of the number of tests that we do. But I think this idea of using real-world events to help seed and then create permutations is actually a really helpful concept. So it's not only real crashes, it can be naturalistic data, it can be your own logs. There's lots and lots of ways to create counterfactual representations of the world. We heard about a few of them earlier with generative AI. But this is one, is to take seed events from real-world crashes. And this whole idea that we were playing with is not a new concept in the world of automated driving evaluation, but it's the question of could we replay those logs and put the Waymo driver into the same conditions with the same level of conflict as the original driver and just evaluate, was it able to have that same sort of response that's needed. We also put into, so the way we divided up these crashes was in two roles. So there's both the initiator, that's the person that does the initial surprising action, and then I developed this concept of a responder, that's the person responding to it. We took the first two parties involved and we just put the Waymo in each role. So I think it's really important to take a step back whenever you're working with real crash data and really recognize that these are real people in really tragic circumstances. So this is the reconstructions we took were from Chandler, Arizona over a 10-year period in the area that we were actively deploying. So these are real people on the roads that had passed. And in this one example, which I have a blurred out photo on there on the right, there was a 107 mile per hour speeder, 17 years old. He was driving a white sedan, and he ran a red light and contacted the driver's side occupant compartment of a white pickup there. It was a Chevrolet Silverado. It was a 37-year-old male, one person in the vehicle, and he was unfortunately fatally injured, and the intoxicated 17-year-old was seriously injured as a result of this crash. So what we did is we took all those and we created reconstructions of those. And we had a third party do this, and this is using HVE crash simulation software, for those of you who are interested. And they recreated the events of the crash leading up to it based on best available information. This was happening at nighttime, and the vehicle, you can see it approaching from the right there, it was on a 45 mile per hour road, and they were traveling at 35 miles per hour. And they had came through on a green light when the speeder popped up, going 107 miles per hour. The reason they know it was 107 miles per hour is because there was camera footage leading up to it that knew the exact speed of it. So, okay, so we did replace both perspectives. I skipped over the initiator. It's because it's quite boring. So in all the initiator, so when you're doing an initiator type replication of events, it ends up becoming just would the Waymo, when it saw a red light, have stopped and not proceeded through and not speeded? Yes, it wouldn't have done those things. So it was 100% effective in the initiator role. So I think it's okay to gloss over for this presentation and just kind of focus on the responder. So that's, you're driving down the road and somebody comes flying through on a red light. Are you going to be able to respond in a timely manner? So when we put the Waymo in this perspective, and you can actually see at the very beginning here, we're trailing this ghost vehicle, which is the original actor. But we're going to catch it because it's in a 45 mile per hour road, it's a clear road, it's a green light, so it's going to gain on it. But what's happening is that immediately at the beginning of the simulation, or of what I'm depicting in the simulation, started before then, it's already starting to slow proactively, and that's because there's a clear line of sight. That's happening at this particular intersection in Phoenix, Arizona. So yeah. So I generally stop at this point because after I put out this paper, I had sent to me from someone inside the company, and I got permission to share the video. And we now share videos all the time of cool things that we see, or cool behaviors by the Waymo that we see. But this was several years ago. It was right when we had some rider-only testing in Chandler, Arizona. So there's nobody in this vehicle. It's actually going in between pickups right now, and the light's red, and it's about to turn green. And if you I'm going to run it forward just a little bit and see if I can stop it. So the light turns green here, and the vehicle starts to proceed through. And I'm going to stop it because what's happening is the light's green, starting to proceed through, about to enter the intersection, and there's a vehicle here. It's pretty far out. I think that's a little bit over 50 meters, right when the earliest detection. So at 50 meters out, especially if they're traveling at maybe at or below speed limit, it's a little, at 45 mile per hour, it's a little hard to tell whether they're going to stop or not, right? So if you proceed just a little bit forward, you'll see the car next to us, which they have a green light. It's an unprotected turn, but there's nobody oncoming. So they're going to continue through, and the Waymo is just going to come to a stop. And that first vehicle narrowly misses it, and that other vehicle just comes flying through. I thought this was interesting to show because it's in the same driving area. You look at the conditions and you say that could have resulted in a higher severity outcome. It's certainly within the realm of things that we were seeing within the fatal reconstruction data set. Maybe a little bit slower, but similar. So you might think in the fatal reconstruction data set, well, weren't the drivers really, weren't a lot of the responders, didn't they have pretty poor response times? And that is accurate, actually. In a lot of the cases we saw, there was just little or no response. So we had this other idea, and that's we have driver behavior models that say, what proper response time is, and it's this idea of, in the middle here, the C, of a non-impaired, eyes-on-road human driver model. And before I kind of describe that, I want to kind of take a step back and think about collision avoidance and the different levels. So one, you have this ideal of 100% avoidance. And there are just some situations that are so extreme where even with the perfect response time, there's just certain performance limits that you're just, it's impossible to avoid every single type of contact out there. So there's this, the ideal is E, but in reality it's really a D. So in the human fatal data set, we saw pretty poor response, which it kind of makes sense. In a lot of these higher severity crashes, there's multiple things going on, right? There's some extreme initiator behavior combined with this sort of, poor response time. There's a lot of combination of effects in general, not always. There's also this idea of an average human driver, which drivers are on a huge spectrum, right? There's many different, you can have many different response times. You can have, were they even looking in the right direction of the conflict? Whether they have some sort of, were they inattentive for whatever reason? And then, so there's just somewhere in the middle. And then what if you were to subselect that and kind of choose only the ones that were non-impaired with their eyes ready and situated on the potential conflict that could enter? So that was the premise of could you create a model like that? And lo and behold, they did, and we've used this for many years, even before this paper. But this the NEON model, we call it, so the non-impaired eyes-on model. And we use this for assessing the response time given that you're inside of a conflict situation. So again, it always has its eyes on conflict. It uses this response time model, and I have another citation there in the end if you want to take note of it from our human behavior analytics team. But the response time's modeled off of this idea of you have an initial surprising thing happens, and then that surprising thing kind of ramps up at some rate, and your response time can be modeled as a function of both of those things. And then lastly, we didn't just there's this idea of, oh, you should have steered left, you steered right, and braked. For this particular model, we give it 3 options. We can look at brake and steer left, brake and steer right, or brake and not steer. So, and we choose the best out of all 3, and that becomes what the NEON model would have done. So we went back to the fatal crash reconstruction data set, and we have another study out on it, and we dropped it in, and we said, okay, now in those cases, how well would the NEON driver would have done? And just taking another step back, if you think of all the times where you're responding to somebody doing something crazy, or somebody doing some initial surprising thing, you're going to initially, you might be able to detect it well in advance before you ever need to take any sort of urgent evasive actions, right? You imagine like the situation there with the person about to run a red light. The car proactively sees it, just comes to a slow stop. There's no sort of evasive action or urgent evasive action required, and just allows it to pass. So that was around 56% of the cases. In the 44% that required an evasive action, that's where we ran the NEON driver through, and we found that it did really, really well. In around 63% of cases, the NEON driver was able to also respond to crashes. And it's similar performance. There's a slight outperformance of the Waymo driver, it's a small data set. But I think what's really important to take away here from it is it's a good reference model that would be effective in these sort of high severity cases had it been equipped. And it also kind of demonstrates the utility of using, subselecting only your higher performing, population of responders. So now going back to how does this kind of relate to the various safety methodologies of Waymo? So one of those methodologies we have is our collision avoidance testing program, where we actually go and take real world, we actually go and create structured tests on a test track. We have well over 10,000 different tests that are done, and we run a sort of crash configuration, like you see here. This is a nice cyclist turn into path, right turn into path. And we then take it back into simulation and we increase the urgency of it. And the idea here is to try to find the limits of the technology and also find the limits of the NEON model. And we use this sort of evaluation throughout our collision avoidance testing cycle for all of our software releases. So. Okay. All right, I'm okay on time. Okay, so I want to talk about what I think is the really cool science right now for evaluating automated driving systems. This is something I've been working almost exclusively on for several years, but it's this idea of in vivo retrospective safety impact work. And I just think there's a lot of opportunity out there for, especially for young researchers trying to dive in and take on a new subject. So I hope I inspire a little bit here. So safety impact's been around for a long time, looking at historical crash rates. It goes back to seat belts and airbags, electronic stability control, automatic emergency braking. There's all sorts of papers out there that basically do what's shown here, where they try to find out some outcome, and the outcome could be a whole bunch of things, but I have it listed here as crashes, but it could be any sort of a bunch of different types of outcomes, safety-related outcomes. And on the bottom, you have some measure of exposure. A common measure of exposure is something like miles. So if you have crashes over miles, you have crash rates. And when you compare some sort of treatment, like an automated driving system, compared to a baseline, which can be any number of baselines, it could be a former version of the system, it could be the overall driving fleet, which is what's commonly done. But it can also be subsets from that driving fleet. You can start to evaluate how effective the technology would be versus some control group. So it's really simple, but it's more challenging in practice because there are a lot of difficulties in creating apples-to-apples comparisons. So I want to kind of go through some of the existing challenges as well when kind of doing this and highlighting kind of efforts to kind of improve that. So we've touched on two different parts. We kind of have had two different strategies to date on measuring retrospective safety impact. The first is on measuring third-party claims rates. So that's the car's in a crash, and then somebody comes and makes a claim for property damage or injury. And then there is the overall crash rate. So which has none of that kind of contribution lens associated with it. So in the claims rate, we have two papers out now. One's been through the peer review cycle, the other one's actively in it. And I'll just touch on that one first. So this was a study done by Swiss Re, who we collaborate with. They're like one of the major reinsurers in the world, and they ran the study, and we collaborated with them in kind of drafting it up, and also with obviously data sharing and interpretation. Swiss Re has a massive repository of claims out there. So there is, in the areas that we drive in, they have over 500,000 claims and 200 billion miles, which really give you some nice small confidence intervals you can compare against. Compared to us, we're only at the time of the study, which was, had data through July 31st, 2024, we had 25 million miles of rider-only driving with 9 property damage and 2 bodily injury claims. Then I don't think I've defined that term for the group, but rider only is our operating fleet without anybody in the driver's seat, right? The car just kind of does it all itself. Nobody has control over the dynamic driving except for the vehicle itself. So, which is different than maybe testing operations where somebody's behind the wheel and they can kind of take control. That doesn't have any of those miles in here. So here's the analysis, and I want to touch on one other thing that this study did, was we saw there's the overall crash population, which how often they're getting third-party claims, but then we said, we asked about, well, what about the latest generation vehicles out there that have all these ADAS systems, like shouldn't there be a lower third-party claim rate for those? And sure enough, if you just sub-select the most recent vehicles, they have a lower rate here, which you can kind of see in the yellow. So it's actually considerable safety benefits by just having a newer vehicle for not generating third-party claims. And I have here on the left some data from the parts consortium where they had shown how much penetration there's been going into model year 2021 versus 2016. So there's the overall driving fleet, which is this blue up here, and then there's the latest generation, which is yellow, and then there's where Waymo's third-party claims rates are for the same areas. And it's pretty striking. So with property damage compared to the overall driving population, there's an 88% reduction and a 92% reduction for property damage and bodily injury, respectively. And then for the latest generation, we saw an 86% reduction and a 90% reduction in property damage and bodily injury. So it's pretty striking that, just the relative frequency between what we'd expect and what we actually observed. So I don't think claims rates is sufficient for evaluating retrospective safety. I think it's a really useful indicator when you kind of be able to apply this contribution lens, but there's this obvious responsibility that the car needs to be able to also respond to crashes where there might not be any sort of contribution associated with it. So you need to be able to look at both. And to do that, we're actively relying on police-reported data, but there's lots of crash data out there that you could rely on. And I think it's also important that you develop targets that are somewhat independent of your actual evaluation. So I first want to talk about the benchmarking work we've done on police-reported crashes. We have 2 studies out there actively. One is just generating overall benchmarks for the areas we drive in. And then the second is on doing this dynamic spatial adjustment for our benchmarks. So if you go and look at the literature on developing crash rate benchmark for automated driving systems, there's over a decade of literature on it, and there was a lot of repeating of benchmarks, and they were often national benchmarks. They were often not controlling for the fact that we were only on surface streets, and they didn't always control for the fact that we're only a passenger vehicle platform. And there are lots of other factors that could influence crash risk. So this study was motivated by this idea that we could start to improve and move the needle a little bit on creating apples to apples exposure comparisons between both the treatment and control by sub-selecting according to actually where the technology is being deployed. So just for context here, so I actually have the national data here, but in addition to that, we took state data, which has both crash and the mileage data, and then you have all the vehicles on the road, and if you just sub-select passenger vehicles, and what that means in a crash database is you're actually removing motorcyclists and you're removing like heavy vehicles and things like that, and other miscellaneous vehicles that are out there on the roads. So if you remove both of those from both the numerator and denominator, your crashes and your mileage, you end up getting a slightly different rate. It's not a huge difference, but it's slightly different. And then if you then remove freeways, you get an even bigger difference. And that's not so surprising because freeway crash risk is about 1/3 of what surface street crash risk is. Depends on where you are, but that's about what it is. So these are 2 or 3, the geographic effect, the vehicle effect, and the road type effect are 3, I think, meaningful additions to the existing literature. Another thing that I wanted to make sure that we did was create multiple different comparison points. So it's not just aligning the exposure apples to apples, but it's also making sure that your outcomes are aligned. And there are lots of different outcomes you could consider. So ignoring how the ADS data is presented for now, just consider like how human benchmark data would be created from police reports. So you have a huge data set, and some of them are property damage, some of them are injury crashes. There's also underreporting, right? Just because I got in a crash and it should have been reported doesn't mean I did report it. That's really well documented by NHTSA about what that is nationally. It's also been documented in San Francisco what it is in that city. So there's this amount of underreporting. So what I've done here is I've shown many different types of benchmarks you could use, ranging from police-reported, unadjusted, to sub-selections of that, to extrapolations upward based on underreporting estimates. And now I'll kind of walk through each of them. So the first thing I think I want to point out is just the relative difference between a crash with any property damage reported versus fatal. It's like 1,000 times difference. That just tells you how many more miles it would take to be able to make a statistical conclusion, on the right versus the left. So I think that's the first thing to point out. The second thing is, as you go rightward, and you don't rely on underreporting, the credibility of your benchmark goes up a lot, right? It's better to take a sub-selection where you're not doing any sort of extrapolation because it is what it is. You saw an observation, you counted it. If you start to do an extrapolation upwards to figure out how much they're mysteriously are missing, then it becomes a lot more challenging. So in this paper, I'm very strongly against using this sort of any property damage or injury, because these are actually both the same, estimating the same thing, and they're wildly different. So it's just very challenging. And the last thing is that you need to know the limitations of your various data sets. In particular, in California, there's this weird thing where there's not a requirement to be in the database if it's only property damage. If it's injury, it must be reported. If it's property damage only, it's not. And I've kind of pieced together what the systematic pattern is for when it is and when it's not. But bottom line is the database just doesn't capture all the property damage. So the unadjusted is it's just not a really great benchmark. So yeah, huge thing to the right of that. It's kind of my recommendation. But in addition to that, we did a second paper, and we got many other ideas in the future, but we're also driving in a city, and a lot of people say, oh, you're only driving on certain roads. Well, in the city, we're driving all the surface streets, like at the top here, and all of them in San Francisco. But our driving is very ordered to where people need ride-hailing services, because that's what we are, which is where all the people are. And it's actually, you can imagine the crash risk is a little different, where like the higher density is versus on the west side there, where there's a lot fewer people in that Sunset region of San Francisco. And not every city is like that, but Phoenix is also like that, where we drive a lot more in the actual city rather than in the suburbs. We're more on the outskirts. And then in Los Angeles, at the time of this study, we're very central right here on this location. So yeah, we had these isolated areas. And then when we went and did the relative crash risk, so we went and said, okay, for these areas where is there a disproportionate amount of driving in the higher risk areas? And sure enough, there is this pattern of it. So we were able to establish that there is a pattern of worse driving in higher risk areas, but just how much of an effect does that have in net effect? Yeah, I gotta speed up. So we kind of went into this effect of the spatial adjustment, and we're able to, and so what we did was we said, okay, what if we take all of the, we know what the Waymo risk is. If we know what the human driver risk is throughout the city and all these different cells, and what if we modeled the human driver as having driven in the same area as the Waymo driver, like kind of redistributed that risk, and we're able to kind of do a spatial adjustment correction to kind of reflect, the difference in driving between them. And in some areas it had a bigger effect, like San Francisco, and then in others, like in Los Angeles, it was kind of a mixed effect, where some areas are actually lower, some are higher. And I'll just note that we also show in the paper that when we originally deployed in San Francisco, we drove in the easier areas. It wasn't because there was a lower risk here, but it turned out to be a lower risk if you did the spatial adjustment. But it's just, as we've gone commercially, it's been way more centered in the higher risk area. So, yeah. Okay, so next thing I want to touch on is a comparison of our data to this benchmark data. And I really want to talk more like future looking, but we have published a paper on this, which is below there, led by my teammate Chris Cassano. So all of our crash data is publicly available with the NHTSA SGO. And all of our crash data where there's any amount of property damage or injury, which is a much lower threshold than what's used in police reported data. So it requires some sort of alignment, again, apples to apples in the outcome and apples to apples in the exposure to kind of make it comparable. The one thing that's not in the SGO that would restrict anyone from doing this analysis is there's no mileage data. So you can't do it. And the data itself, I think it's pretty limited in what's in those reports. So we recognized that. We put out this paper, and we said, well, we have to actually release the data to enable people to replicate it, and more importantly, to extend it, because we cannot be the only ones doing this sort of research out there. And so what we do is we have a dashboard online where you can actually go there, download all that mileage data and that sort of heat map, and allow you to kind of take it and use it for yourself, however you feel like you should use it. And you also have the crash, and we also include supplemental crash data that you can merge directly with that unique identifier for the SGO, and able to kind of supplement it and use additional data elements. So I think it's really helpful, And so in addition to the 7 million mile study, which I haven't shown results for, by putting on the dashboard, what we also did was we released our results against these peer-reviewed, published benchmarks that we've put out and pre-specified. So as we're driving, we're continuously comparing to them. So the 3 that we have up there now is this airbag deployment crashes, injury reporting crashes, and fewer police reported, which are kind of where the statistical significance kind of allows you. But as we get more miles, you can hopefully do even more analyses. You'll note the slightly lower police reported, and that's because of that underreporting, again, in the human police reported, which is unadjusted. But this is actually an upward adjustment of the injury causing, but there's no adjustment of airbags. So, the one really important thing I hope is recognized is that we've done over 50 million miles right now on commercial operations on public roads. We are exposed quite frequently to a lot of those higher severity type crashes that I showed earlier, and I think it's important to kind of take a step back and look at, the things you're not seeing in the crash database that could have been there, with poor response time or inattention or whatever. So, in the top left here, there's a young girl that pops out from behind a vehicle that her mom's packing her bags into. The Waymo car comes to a complete stop. In the top right, you have a left turn across path opposite direction crash. It's the number 2 highest severity intersection crash in the United States. It contributes a lot to our serious injury risk in the U.S. That one, the Waymo driver not only brakes, but it also steers to the right through a bike lane because it knows that no one's in the bike lane. It's able to evade that crash. Bottom left here, you actually have a pedestrian that also avoids the crash, but he runs out from an occluded a building, a nice little urban canyon type thing. And then on the bottom right here, you have a child on a bicycle that pops out. So it's just constant exposure to things that could have higher severity outcome. I'm a big advocate for kind of supporting the external research community, and kind of, as you can tell, I really want people to start to do this work. I think there's a lot of cool opportunity for young researchers especially. So I want to talk about a couple different efforts that we've joined in on. So one is we've collaborated on this set of best practices for helping people do this kind of work. So what we did was we all, a bunch of people from academics, from the automated driving community, and then also from the insurance community came together, and we were talking about certain challenges that we were seeing, and we were kind of listing them out. And what we found ourselves doing was making recommendations, and those recommendations turned into a checklist, and we published that checklist last year. And it's really, I think it's a really useful guide for people that are doing the work and trying to follow along and make sure they're dotting their I's and crossing their T's. It's really basic science, but it has that kind of flavor of, this is for the application of automated driving systems. I also think it's really helpful if you're ever a reviewer to kind of follow along with the checklist and make sure people are doing that appropriately. That checklist was recommended that we submit it for a future ISO project. So that is actually, it was approved as a preliminary work item and is ongoing. So if anyone else wants to join up and contribute to this ISO, it's great because we're taking the RAVE checklist, and with a larger international community, we're hoping to iterate and turn it into an international standard. So I'm really excited about that, and it's a cool little development. All right, 5 minutes left. I'll take some questions. Thank you so much.